So thank you guys. I have to say so far this has been really interesting and fascinating. I love this diverse group and I hope that I'll be picking up on some themes that other people have touched on at least. And this workshop's a fun opportunity for me to think about popularizing science because, as Chris mentioned, I practice some form of science communication myself. But as a historian, I've really tried to shy away from it. So it's like this odd dichotomy, right? And the reason I've tried to, or I used to try to shy away from it in the first few years of my PhD research, was that I felt that it didn't have a lot to do with my central research questions, which are more focused on methodology and practice. But in fact, I've come to realize, as I'm sure many of you know, that these things are actually very much intertwined, this popularizing science and the methodology, or at least they can be. And they're not really easy to separate. So I've come to realize that and actually find that that's what's interesting about these types of topics. And so I'd like to use this venue to explore something I've just started thinking about in the past few months, and so bear with me. And I have to say a caveat first, which is that missing links, I know, is a problematic term. And I'm using it here because historically, especially in the early time period that I'm talking about, this was a term they were using, right? But I do recognize that it's problematic, it's not really representative of phylogenies, and that we could have a whole workshop on missing links or the concepts associated with it. So I just have to get that out of the way. So, what constitutes good science? Who does good science? Where do they do it? And who do they share it with? These are not questions that tend to necessarily rise to the surface in popular science. Usually these questions of good science happen more behind closed doors in scientific, offices or venues. And popular audiences, on the other hand, are more likely to just be presented with a fossil, for example, and told what it is, rather than confronted with questions of how scientists know, necessarily. But when it's the scientists themselves who are doing the popularizing, these questions can become interwoven into the public-facing aspects in interesting ways. So today I'd like to travel to South Africa to visit a few scientists who have debated these issues of what is good science while doing something I find rather interesting, and that is addressing these issues publicly and deliberately. And we're going to look at two episodes today in the history of paleoanthropology, which I'm sure, as you know, is the field of human paleontology, essentially. And in these two cases, scientists were explicitly arguing that good science was popular science, in a sense. It was science that was entirely open, it was freely communicated, and it was free from any sort of shackles of expertise or experts themselves, any kind of limiting factor. So this is a story about scientists who popularized their own work, not only to further their conclusions about particular fossils, but also to forward their ideas about how science should be done. And the two stories we'll look at today, one surrounds the Taung Child here from 1925, and the other concerns the Homo naledi remains announced in 2015. And in both of these instances, scientists really engaged with the press, I think, in interesting ways. So just to give you a quick roadmap of the talk, first I'd like to outline a problem that I see paleoanthropology is having that may be unique to paleoanthropology or may not. I'm interested to hear your feedback. And that is a problem of over-popularization in a sense. And I want to outline that before talking about the Taung Child for a while and some of the odd ways that the Taung Child was engaged in the media before moving on to the more recent story of Homo naledi. And so paleoanthropology is an interesting discipline in which to examine popular science, I think, because the fossils of human ancestors are of a certain amount of inherent personal interest. Not across the board by any means, but when a fossil hominin is unearthed, it usually does make headlines, right? In general, people are fascinated by these vaguely human-looking faces of our fossil relatives. But as we all know, and as we've been talking about especially today, the claims that these headlines, and in fact the articles themselves often make, are not reflective of necessarily rigorous peer-reviewed consensus or anything like that, but instead claims from a particular point of view that are often sensationalized and can be very problematic. And this problem's not new by any means. In 1923, Marcelin Boule pointed out that, quote, "From the very moment of its announcement, each new discovery relating to our ancestors becomes the subject of numerous articles in the press. Importantly," he noted, quote, "the substance of those articles could easily be criticized, though they indicate the lively and justifiable curiosity of the people." And so when you have this interest, you have this widespread circulation, well, is that a problem? Aren't we usually trying to get that out of science? Well, it definitely can lead to some weird things. For example, you end up hearing a lot about missing links, like truly a lot. And then you also, this is a great story too, but you also end up hearing some very odd things about those missing links, like this recent one. And this less weird, but still, you know. So you've got these kind of weird things happening in the press, right? And additionally, this constant coverage can lead to some confusion. If people are frequently hearing about the missing link, overturning everything we know about our own human story, they can feel misled and perplexed. This letter to the editor concerning our Taung Child is one example. Here's a reader who just wants the definitive, straightforward answer to whether or not the Taung Child is a missing link, which is kind of hilarious if you study the history of paleoanthropology, because this was a huge scientific debate that went on for decades. So this is not something that necessarily the editor can answer, but it shows how frustrated the average person might get by these kind of claims floating around in the press. And so this confusion has the potential to damage the science in the eye of the public, potentially, turning people away from it. What if last year's missing link is overturned by this year's and next year's? Or worse, what if it's revealed to be a forgery or a misidentified pig fossil? With a notoriously fragmentary fossil record, paleoanthropology is especially susceptible to these types of errors that can really be magnified by the press. And it's these problems, among others admittedly, that has led some paleoanthropologists to hesitate in endorsing further popularizing their science. So keeping in mind these general concerns of the curiosity of the people and this problematic data set, let's take a look at that Taung Child story and the ways that popular science became an integral part of the methodology surrounding the fossil. So some of you may be familiar with the Taung Child. It was discovered when it was blasted out of a limestone cliffside in South Africa at a quarry. This beautiful little skull belonged to a small primate, probably about 3 years old, so it's definitely a juvenile. And it was really surprising at the time in its anatomy. It displayed a mixture of human and ape characters in a manner that hadn't been seen before. And the anatomy really led to a wide variety of claims about what it could be. And these claims ranged from a missing link all the way down to an uninteresting baby gorilla. So the skull was studied initially by anatomy professor Raymond Dart, working at the nearby University of Witwatersrand, located in Johannesburg. Dart had recently come to South Africa by way of London, where he had received his medical training. And once in South Africa, and once he found the Taung Child, he quickly found a very important ally in the paleontologist, I'm sure many of you know, the mammal-like reptile expert, Robert Broom. And so from the outset, Dart's strategy of communication tactics with the Taung Child was vastly different from anything that had been seen before. For example, when Dart first announced his description of the fossil and his conclusion that it was an important link in human evolution, it was not at a scientific meeting or in the pages of a scientific journal, as was customary, but instead it first appeared in the local South African paper, The Star, in a wild story where essentially the newspaper scooped nature, which is a great story if you want to hear later. So this is the beginning of really a divergent career trajectory for the fossil in the public eye. And Dart's Nature paper did eventually, didn't come out about the Taung Child about a week later. And at that point, two of Britain's foremost anatomists and previous mentors of Dart, Grafton Elliott Smith and Sir Arthur Keith, commented on the find. Elliott Smith from his post at University College London, and Arthur Keith from his position at the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons. And these two important anatomists, while they at least entertained the possibility that maybe this was an important human ancestor, they did point out that unless proven, it was still just as likely to be a baby gorilla. Now, Dart and Broom were very disheartened by these responses. They saw them as attacks and unfair dismissals. Dart had worked hard, he felt. It had taken him a long time to prepare the fossil, he felt. Maybe in other eyes, not quite as long. But he had been carefully cleaning the fossil with his wife's knitting needles that he had borrowed for the purpose. And he was pretty proud of his work. So he saw this criticism of his beautiful fossil as quite unfair. But Elliott Smith and Keith, however, just wanted him to take more time before he made such drastic claims on the fossil. Time to compare the fossil to other primates, and to study it more closely, provide more measurements, and all the things that generally need to be done to justify such a large claim as a missing link. The divisions deepened between Dart and Broom on one side and Elliott Smith and Keith, among others, on the opposite side. As Dart and Broom began to cast Elliott Smith and Keith in this role of sort of the old guard of British paleoanthropology. They saw them as having too much control over the message. I mean, who were they to shut down Dart's interpretation? They actually hadn't even seen the fossil yet when they published their original dismissals. Dart and Broom really began envisioning them as gatekeepers to knowledge, two men that controlled scientific opinion along with resources, publication possibilities, and other important things to do their science. So thus, Dart and Broom began to take steps to bypass them entirely and take their fossil, along with their grievances about the way the science was being done, straight to the public. So here's an example of a public exhibit that I'll have a better picture in a moment and I'll talk about. So now, Keith and Elliott Smith were located here in London, which is far away from the South African fossil that remained down there in South Africa. They had been requesting a cast of the fossil in the months following the announcement. And Keith, for example, wanted a replica over at the Hunterian where he could compare it to his vast collection of ape skulls and get a better idea of where it sat in the story of human evolution. But when the first replica of Taung did show up in London, it wasn't at a museum for study, but instead ended up on display for the public here. So in the summer of 1925, Taung appeared at the Wembley Empire exhibition, a display that was to showcase the diversity of the cultures in the empire. Taung was displayed next to a poster illustrating Dart's idea of its place in the human family tree, which was at the base. And here's just an example of Dart being so confident about his designation of the fossil that he put it directly in front of the people. Dart had some busts commissioned by a South African sculptor for this exhibit. And so Dart had really bypassed his colleagues as they saw it. He had acted quickly, not only in preparing and announcing his fossil, which he did do in under 3 months, but also in making massively bold claims about its place in human evolution. And so what's interesting is when pressed on this, it became apparent that to Dart and Broom, this was more than just a publicity stunt or an overly confident fossil assertion, but it was actually the definition of good science. Dart had found something incredible. He had made knowledge of it available as quickly as he could, and he had been clear about his position on what he thought it was. Broom would later argue that, quote, a scientist who boldly shows where he thinks the evidence leads is preferable to one who is too cautious to express any opinion. But what about this problem of being too hasty in the press that we talked about a minute ago and the problems that can raise? What if the missing link claim was so contested and possibly overturnable that people would have to write letters to the editor to try to sort it out? Well, to Broom, this got to another core aspect of science, and that is being wrong wasn't necessarily a problem. Expressing an opinion that would later turn out to be wrong wasn't bad, it was bold. Broom argued, quote, we may think wrongly, but independent views are often more interesting. There's no shame in false conclusions or retracting things. That was just how science worked. But other scientists didn't agree, still taking the stance, like the one I outlined earlier, that the eager public might be confronted with something they thought was true and then found out wasn't true, and it was just a dangerous idea. So they still maintained, Keith and Elliott Smith, that conclusions should be well thought out, timed, measured, backed up, all of those things that they were used to seeing. And here's an example of the kind of popular writing that Broom would do, this one for Scientific American, to argue for the fossil's place in human evolution. And Broom pointed out that there were other benefits to talking directly to the public. The public could actually help you do your science, for example, find fossils. Broom argued that, quote, he who works with the press gets far ahead of the one who works in secret. The public, it seems to me, should know what's going on, and as a rule, they are only too delighted to be of assistance. So now fast forward to the 21st century, and Raymond Dart has been held up as a visionary who faced unfair odds and managed to see promise in an extraordinary fossil. The Taung Child was eventually accepted as a human ancestor, but as I mentioned, it took decades. And so, historically speaking, he sort of won. And this story has been framed as sort of an old versus new way of doing paleoanthropology. He won because he was bold, because he did things a certain way, because he was willing to take a chance, and that's the way the history has been cast, in part due to his own work telling his own story. So of course there's a dichotomy that overlooks many nuances, claiming there's an old guard versus the new guys, but that is the dichotomy that Dart and Broom, amongst others, built. So it's worth keeping that in mind as we move to the example from 2015. So this is also from South Africa. Many of you may have been familiar when this was in the headlines just a couple of years ago. And it struck me as similar in some interesting ways. So I could go on forever about this wonderful collection of bones. They were discovered deep in an underground chamber. They've been named Homo naledi, and they too have taken this slightly different scientific trajectory as far as public opinion. It's worth mentioning that, first of all, this is not one individual, this is composite. There were thousands of bones found, and it is, numerically speaking, the biggest discovery in the history of human evolution. It's the most we've ever found in one place. So Lee Berger, who's also at the University of Witwatersrand, was the leading scientist on this. And like Taung, he took an approach with his fossils that was hugely controversial. So first of all, when Lee Berger became aware that these fossils were in this cave, the first two things he did was, one, to call National Geographic, and two, to put out a call on Facebook to have paleoanthropologists help him excavate the finds. He was later quoted saying that a post on Facebook may turn out to be as important as a graph or as a paragraph in Nature. So time was an issue for the Homo naledi fossils, just as it was for Taung. A lot of the things Berger did were seen as rushed. For example, the excavations happened very quickly. And Berger once said that, quote, history would not forgive me if I didn't act quickly, end quote. Some say that this resulted in sloppy excavation and damage to the bones. And not to mention that National Geographic did fund the entire thing, which also involved them bringing in cameras to this tight cave space that was hugely invasive and very controversial. So the whole ordeal that surrounded the Homo naledi bones has been called a media circus. Some have suggested the circus threatens to again split paleoanthropology into old and new schools, which damages attempts to understand the path of human evolution. But others point out that it could be a boost to the field. After the excavations, the results also came out rather quickly, just as in the case of Taung. Following a rejection from Nature, the initial papers were published in an open access journal, eLife, which appeared less than 2 years after the initial discovery. One of eLife's journal's slogans is "Get your results out fast." Berger has been quoted saying, "I've never seen any rule about a timestamp on how great science is produced," end quote. But there were errors in the papers. There were typos, there were measurement inconsistencies, and other scientists had said the work was hastily done and they think the quality suffered. So much like Dart, it was called to be too quick and not careful enough. Like Broom, Berger believes that the best way to advance the field is to make information available to the community as quickly as possible and allow his colleagues to form their own hypotheses. Being open access, the data is all available online, and Lee Berger provides 3D print map things that I don't quite understand, so you can print the fossil yourself somehow, if you're magical as far as I'm concerned. And he says that this is a better way to do science because, quote, many minds make better science, end quote. But like Broom and Dart, this is controversial not only because it can be seen as sloppy, but because it's accompanied with bold claims about the origin of our lineage. Berger says, quote, controversy isn't a dirty word. If you aren't creating controversy and changing the fundamental ways the science is done, then perhaps you're not pushing the boundaries of science. You are conforming. That, perhaps, is a dirty word in science, end quote. And this, again, is a stark contrast to other scientists who really are said to not release information until they're sure about their claims, until they've done all of the legwork, which Berger, Broom, and Dart all contended is bad science. It's equivalent to fossil hoarding. It restricts access to others. It's not a good way to do it. So here's just a picture to show the sort of, quote, media circus. And I have to say there were a lot of press conferences, there were a lot of documentaries, a lot of social media, a lot of noise was made about this discovery. And some have pointed out that, of course, this has brought in funding, and the funding is necessary to do the science. But others have brought this back to these same issues of being wrong. And some have come to Berger's defense, saying that, like Broom, Berger's just not afraid to be wrong with his claims. One researcher was quoted saying, "A lot of people in our business are petrified to be wrong, and you have to be willing to be wrong. What Lee's doing takes that to another level." So again, sort of embodying this Broom idea that wrong is not the worst thing. But others go back to that original argument, which says that being wrong in the public eye is, quote, irresponsible, because these proclamations momentarily seize the public's attention in news and go straight into textbooks. The retractions rarely do, end quote. So here's that old idea that making these bold claims does have consequences in the public eye. So just to wrap up, these are very brief discussions of two pretty explicit examples where scientists are communicating not only their ideas about the fossil itself, but their values and methods about science. They're arguing that good science is public-facing, and it's something that's widely shared and discussed, even if it's something that's potentially overturned a few years later. And they're using their very iconic fossils to make these arguments. It could be that this is just a common practice in paleontology, and I look forward to hearing from you. But this approach is certainly rare and very controversial, as I've tried to show, in paleoanthropology, both then and today. So these two stories have just given me a lot to think about in that sense. So thank you.